Differentiation, fun approaches to meeting the needs of learners. Differentiation engages with the differences that each child has in different educational settings. At the moment that might be school or it might be home. And this presentation is to look at a scenario where you have a simple activity that can be differentiated to different levels of learners, and then a challenge for you to develop it for your own hypothetical classroom that you created at the beginning of this course. To start off, it's worth engaging with some of the differences that you might come into contact with inside of a classroom. Some of the differences might not strike you as drastically altering the engagement in a class. However, they can have an impact. If you think, for example, the way in which a child with an older sibling has the opportunity to pick up patterns and habits from that older sibling and the way they adopt them very quickly, their behaviour would be different to a child who has no elder siblings at home or is the eldest at home themselves. Also consider a parent who has got the elder sibling has already got some strategies to help facilitate education. So some of those even minor differences might make a huge impact. Consider pausing me for a moment now and just looking at the hypothetical classroom or your educational setting, whether that be home or a classroom, and think about what the differences are. To enhance this as a reflective practice, consider what those differences are likely to lead to. So again, there being an older sibling at home, picking up those patterns, but then equally, what sort of things could you consider to put in place to facilitate those differences and ensure everyone is able to make progress? As I've mentioned, as an educator, whether that be a parent, NQT, or veteran teacher, the aim is to consider the needs of all of the students in the class. You have to consider their pace, their individual interests, and give each and every one of them the opportunity to achieve, which isn't always quite so straightforward, especially when you have a vast amount of differences. But the next scenario will take you through how a simple task can be scaled up or down to meet the needs of a variety of different learners. The scenario in question covers a literacy lesson with the overarching theme of water. The student in question came from a Year 1 and reception mixed class, and it's a small class at that, which usually has an exposure to a teaching assistant and classroom teacher. The current scenario is different because this child is being homeschooled. Fortunately or unfortunately, whichever way you look at it, it just so happens that his mum is a teacher. The activity in question, as I mentioned, is focused on water. My son picked the theme of water for himself. So, with that in mind, I went away and got a copy of a poem. It's a 4-line stanza. It's a short poem. It uses a mixture of onomatopoeic words. It has a variety of rhyming. It's got some CVC, nouns, verbs, and adjectives. All of that would wash completely over the top of my son's head, but we can still engage with it. The activity was to read the poem on the given theme, but the skills we developed were vast. Some of them were phonemes, repeating sounds, popular sounds, and it continues. If you look at the poem in the picture there, you'll notice you've got 2 different pronunciations of the letter T. Trickling starts with a hard consonant T sound. By the third word in the, you've got the th sound created by the digraph TH. At the bottom of the page, we'd identified different colours for each of the words beginning with letters. So trickling and the, both beginning with T, would both be required to be coloured in purple. He was able to do this easily, and it created a really interesting discussion around the way that different letters, or rather the same letter, can create different sounds. Thinking about splashing, the s in sh and s in sp. Thinking how those blends can create the different interests and the different effects. If we then quickly look at the ways that this can be scaled up or down according to a child's ability, it can become really fun. Now my son and I read this poem together There were some words within it that I knew he would find easy and straightforward, so I asked him to read them, the CVC words, or the three-letter words, or the shorter words. But if the child is at a more advanced stage for their reading, you could ask them to read this poem entirely independently. Alternatively, you could read the poem for the child. To make it more complex, instead of using those initial letters, you could ask the child to identify the vowel sounds and group the words accordingly. Alternatively, push them even further and ask them to group by type, so nouns, verbs, or adjectives. Alternatively, to make it easier, you rely on the initial letter and look for the shape of the letter rather than knowing what those letters are. Ask them to draw the letters in the air and think only about sounds, repeating the sounds as you go through the poem. As a development, again enhancing it, you could ask the student to write their own stanza, the next stanza, to keep the poem going. However, if that's too challenging, you could ask the student to draw what happens next, or even draw a picture from the poem they've just read, asking them to label as appropriate, helping them with spellings and formation of words. To make it more complex again, ask the students to change the popular words. For particularly advanced students, and here you'd be looking more for year 2, you could ask the students to use a picture thesaurus to replace the words for themselves. Again, this could be very complex, but to break it down a little bit, you could ask the student to copy the popular words into a handwriting book to be able to get the shape and formation of key words. Equally, you could take some of those popular words and discuss with a TA how it might be used in another sentence. So, for example, you take the word tap, it's something that water comes from, it's also something you can do to a friend. If you gently tap them on their shoulder. It also gives you the opportunity to talk about the way that you approach somebody and you tap them gently, demonstrating that too. The opportunities become much more creative. Equally, within this activity, you start to engage with number. If you think about tallying the amount of consonant sounds, identifying the popular sound, doing a number value, putting them in the order of which one appears the most and least, you start again to develop a variety of skills. It's just a short way of engaging with taking something very simple and developing it into something much more meaningful for the individual child. Your challenge now is to keep the theme of water and the fact that you have a literacy focus, but I want you to make it relevant for your setting, whether that's your imaginary classroom for the short course that we're talking about, the one that you're going to be teaching in September for any NQTs involved, or maybe as a parent, think about your home life, think about what's appropriate for your child. Remember, your aim is to provide just enough challenge, but not so much that it becomes a reason to disengage and give up. It's supposed to be fun. Something like this can really stretch across the education band. If you imagine, in this case, we're looking at a child who is just entering formal education. Indeed, my son doesn't have to attend school yet. So everything we're doing here is preparing him for year 1. If you think about the top end of the primary school setting, so year 6, you could start to look at all of those synonyms for water and maybe start to engage with onomatopoeia and start to think about the ways that the letters can form and maybe even be shaped within a poem. If you dial it up to year 9, so this is pre-GCSE, you might start to engage with short stories that have the theme of water, and then again start to think about spelling and punctuation and developing that breadth of vocabulary and identifying them again by word clusters, but introducing prepositions and adverbs. If you take that even further into higher, or rather further education, the theme of water can become very symbolic. I study this with my A-level students and look at different characters, and the way that they symbolically use water becomes really interesting. I'd be really thrilled to hear about what you do with this task. For those of you that are on the short course, you know my email address, and for anyone listening in any other setting, please feel free to comment. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.